Greetings, Brookings Bio students. This is Mrs. Rydell. And in this slideshow, we're going to take a look at sections of chapter 16 and 17 in your book and look at some patterns of evolution in populations. We just finished our little activity that we did with the lima beans, and we talked about the idea of polygenic traits. Remember, polygenic traits are traits that are controlled by two or more genes. And we talked about a lot of different examples. Back in our genetics chapter, we talked about polygenic traits. That was one of our vocab words. Traits that are controlled by two or more genes show a pattern called a bell curve. If you were to make a graph of the population, what you see is lots of in-betweens. We don't just have tall people, short people, white people, black people, lots of in-betweens. And so we see that typical bell curve. And we made a bell curve when we looked at our little skin color activity. We made a bell curve when we measured sizes of lima beans. It's very typical of traits that are polygenic. So let's take a look at what would happen to a population graph like this if evolution is happening in the population. And if you remember that word fitness we talked about in our earlier slideshow, the idea of fitness, your ability to survive and reproduce in your environment. And if you look at a bell curve, individuals that are near each other on the curve, probably not very much difference in their fitness. If you were measuring height, for example, a person that is 5'8" is not going to be very much different in their fitness than a person who's 5'7" or 5'9". But if you look at the population overall, the organisms that are at the extremes, that are the far ends of that curve, there could be a big difference in fitness. Think about heights in people. A 3-foot tall person could have a difference in fitness compared to an 8-foot tall person or a 7-foot tall person. Where you have differences in fitness, natural selection can act on the population and select for those traits that are best able to survive and reproduce in that place. So let's look at a couple different patterns that we see in populations as they evolve. The very first kind is called directional selection. Next, we have stabilizing selection. And third kind of pattern that we see is something called disruptive selection. And we're going to take a look and talk about those three patterns and see how they look, how they work, and what happens to a bell curve when we change the population through natural selection. If you look at that first type of selection, directional selection, what happens is the population, if you look at individuals in the population, the individuals at one end of the curve have higher fitness than organisms in the middle or at the other end. And what's going to happen then is the graph is going to shift over in one direction or the other. Remember, we saw that little video about hummingbird beaks, and differences in sizes of your beak affects how you can get your food. So if you were to make a graph of a population, and remember, everybody's different, so some hummingbirds are going to have medium beaks, some will have smaller, some will have larger beaks. Having a bigger beak, if you're in a situation where you have long flowers, for example, it's going to cause the graph to shift over. Larger beak ones are going to survive, smaller beak ones will die off, and it causes a shift in the graph. It can shift either direction. We also watched that video, the Evolve video about pygmy mammoths on the island. And as the sea level rose and the mammoths had to climb up the mountain to get food, the larger, taller, bigger ones had a harder time climbing the mountain. They were top heavy and they tipped over. They couldn't get up the hill. And the smaller, being smaller, helped you get up the hill and get to food. And over time, the shortness and stature was selected for, and you ended up with a whole population of pygmy mammoths living on that island. So graphs can shift either way, to the right or to the left. You like this kind of shift when we talk about test scores. If you think about making a a bell curve that shows test scores on a test, you're going to have some very low scores, very high scores, mostly C. C is average. But if you have a test that's really difficult and many people don't score as high as they would normally score, maybe everybody gets a D average on the test instead of a C average, and you say, can we curve the test? Can we curve the grade? And what you're doing is kind of like directional selection. You're taking that graph of where is the B and where is the C and shifting it over to make it so the people who got D grades now have C grades. Works the same way in a population. So example, think about beak sizes in birds. Remember, beaks are going to vary, and birds with bigger beaks can feed more easily on seeds that have hard, thick shells. And suppose something happens in an ecosystem to cause a shortage of smaller or medium-sized seeds. In that situation, could be a virus that moves in and wipes out certain plants, could be a climate change happening where certain plants stop growing in that place, and birds with bigger beaks would be selected for because they could crush and eat those bigger seeds, and the smaller beaked ones are not going to be able to get food, and you'd see a shift in the population graph. The second kind of pattern that we see is called stabilizing selection. And in stabilizing selection, individuals at the center of the curve have higher fitness than either end. And the graph is going to stay in the same place but narrows. The middle is going to increase and the sides are going to decrease. Example, if you made a graph of brightness of color feathers in birds, think about birds that you know ones we have around in South Dakota, for example, cardinals. Males are usually much more showy or brighter colored than the females. Why would that be? Females, first of all, want to blend in. They don't want to be seen sitting on a nest and incubating eggs. You don't want the predators to see you. So females usually have a little drabber color than the males. But males require a showy feathers, showy bright colors to attract females. Think peacock tail. Remember we talked about birds mating dances. The male bird has to get the females to notice them and pick them in order to be able to reproduce and pass on their genes. It is kind of a balance here. Male birds that don't have very bright colors are not going to get chosen. They don't get to reproduce. But having too bright colors not only gets the girls to notice you, but also gets the predators to notice you. So those birds also are going to be less likely to survive. And over time, the graph kind of shifts toward the middle. It's better. You want to be bright enough to have the females pick you, but not so bright that you are noticed by predators and get eaten. So there's kind of a shift in the population to more of a middle brightness in color. We see that same pattern in human birth weights. If you look at birth weights of babies when they're born, human babies that are born with a very low birth weight are less likely to survive. Preemie babies, unless you are born in a place where there's hospital, where there's intensive care, neonatal specialists to take care of a baby that's born, 1 or 2 pound baby has a very hard time and lots of medical issues, less likely to survive. The flip of that is that babies that are born too large also have a difficulty surviving. Really, really large babies, unless you have medical care where you can get a C-section, a cesarean to remove that baby, a lot of times a baby that is too large to get out through the birth canal is going to, not only will the baby die, but oftentimes the mother dies as well. And so over time, we've kind of selected for the babies that are what we call average size. About 6 pounds is average for a baby. The third kind of pattern that we see is called disruptive selection. Individuals in this population, the ones at the extremes of the curve, have higher fitness than the ones in the middle. And it can actually cause the middle to decrease and the ends to increase, and can cause the graph to actually split into two a kind of a two-humped graph. You have two very more different populations. It creates two distinct phenotypes. If you're talking about beak size and you're selecting for small and large beaked birds, the middle ones are decreasing. Over time, this can lead to two distinct species. Remember Darwin's idea about the mystery of mysteries. Where do new species come from? This is exactly the kind of thing that produces two different species, new species from a common population, ancestor population. And if those differences keep being selected for over time, more and more differences accumulate, eventually you end up with two populations that are actually different enough that they are different species. Example, suppose in a bird population you're living in an area where climate change or a virus or something happens to cause a change in the seeds, the plants that grow there. And medium-sized seeds become scarce. Well, maybe the large and smaller seeds are more plentiful. Birds with bigger or smaller beaks would have greater fitness, and over time that population may split into two groups, one that eats small seeds, one that eats large seeds. Think about the birds on the Galapagos Islands when Darwin saw the finches there with all the different kinds of beaks. Remember, common ancestor, but over time they changed to adapt, to become different, to fit the places where they lived and to eat the foods that were available to them. If you look also at evolutionary patterns that we see in the fossil records, we're going to talk about some of those different kind of patterns that we see. And we are talking about macroevolution now. Microevolution is change, for example, one species of fish changing, evolving to be a new species of fish. But fish to fish, frogs to frogs, bacteria to bacteria, we would call that microevolution. Macroevolution deals with long periods of time, great evolutionary changes, and we're talking about fish being the ancestors to amphibians, where we're actually changing not just species level, but we're talking about bigger changes that are going to get us different kinds of organisms. That would be macroevolution. And if we look at the fossil record, we can kind of see some patterns in the fossil record that show some different ways that this happens. So we're going to make a list and then we'll talk about them. Number one, mass extinction. Number two, adaptive radiation, also called divergent evolution. We talked about this a little bit in our slideshow when we looked at evidence for Darwin's theory. Convergent evolution as well. Remember, converge means to come together, and we talked about that a little bit too in our last slideshow. Coevolution, and something called punctuated equilibrium. All of these are patterns that we see in the fossil record. So let's talk about them a little bit. At several times in the Earth's history, large numbers of species have gone extinct at the same time. We're not talking about slowly over time, one species dying out or this species numbers going down. We're talking about a huge number of species all at once disappearing out of the fossil record. It's called an extinction, mass extinction, and can be caused by several things. Talk about erupting volcanoes. Usually this is a major environmental change that happens on the planet. Plate tectonics, continents moving. We talked about the idea of continents moving around from changing position from that early Pangea to the positions where we are now. Looking at changing sea level, climate change, asteroids hitting the Earth. We're talking about major changes to an ecosystem that are going to cause great loss of a large number of species all at one time. we talked about the idea of climate change back in our human impact chapter, and climate change is changing the organisms that live on the planet. We're talking about lots of endangered species. We talked about polar bears becoming endangered due to climate change and melting of the ice caps, causing a big change in the number of organisms that live on our planet. All at once, they disappear out of the fossil record. Example, at the end of the Mesozoic era, and eras are usually separated by events that happen in organisms that are alive. In Mesozoic era, at the end of the Mesozoic, more than half of all plants and animals were wiped off the face of the earth. They just disappeared all at once out of the fossil record, and that includes the dinosaurs. This is when the dinosaurs went extinct. This is not the only extinction. There's actually been 5 big extinctions at different times throughout our history, but this is the one we kind of know about and remember. And scientists believe it was due to the impact of an asteroid that changed the climate on the planet. We have evidence for that. They found a crater hundreds of miles across down in the Yucatan Peninsula down by Mexico. We have evidence of a impact event, something big hitting the earth, looking at the crystals in rock show an impact, and also evidence of the asteroid theory. There's molecules that are found in outer space, things like asteroids and meteors, something called iridium that is not very common on Earth. And if you look at the rocks that are laid down at the time the dinosaurs disappeared, there's a huge spike in the amount of iridium that's laid down in that rock layer. It suggests that there was an asteroid or something big that hit the planet Earth and caused the dinosaurs and many of the other animals and plants that lived at that time to disappear. One of the effects of mass extinctions is when you take out a huge number of organisms out of the ecosystem, often opens up habitats and opportunities for the remaining species that don't go extinct to spread into new niches, to move into new places. And usually after a mass extinction, there's a huge increase in the number of new species that develop after that. Mass extinctions, there's always a burst of evolution, and we get new species. After the dinosaurs disappeared, the Cenozoic era was followed by what we call Age of Mammals. The mammals, number of different kinds of mammals, species of mammals that we see in the fossil record just exploded after the dinosaurs disappeared. When those predators were gone, left openings for other organisms to move into new places, find new niches, and huge increase in the number of new species. When a single species or small group has evolved through natural selection from a common ancestor into different kinds of organisms, remember we talked about that idea of adaptive radiation or divergent evolution. Diverge means to go separate ways, split apart. And if you look at this in the fossil record, we see evidence of this in many, many places. That's what happened on the Galapagos when we talk about Darwin going there and seeing the different tortoises, different neck links on different islands, the beaks on the birds. Common ancestor, remember these are volcanic islands that had ancestor organisms move into the island from the nearest mainland from South America. But over time, as they moved to different ecosystems, different habitats, filled new niches, changed to become different. Sometimes different organisms evolve in different places or at different times, but because they are living in an ecologically similar environment, they end up looking very similar. And we talked about that idea when we talked about the idea of convergent evolution. Converge means to come together. So unrelated organisms, or ones that don't share a recent ancestor, but becoming more alike because they are adapting to live in the same kind of ecosystem. We talked about the idea of sharks and dolphins, penguins. They all developed similar body shapes, streamlined bodies, appendages, fins, and flippers to help them move through water, even though they don't share a recent common ancestor. Penguins are birds. Shark are fish. Dolphins are mammals. Because they are adapting to live in a similar ecosystem, they have evolved to look similar, have physical features that are alike. The third kind of evolution that we didn't talk about, the next kind of evolution on our list, is a process called coevolution. And we haven't talked about this yet, but we did talk about something that's related. Remember, we talked in our ecosystem chapter, interactions of organisms, we talked about the idea of symbiosis, different organisms interacting in some way that gives a benefit to one or both of those organisms. We talked about mutualism, we talked about parasitism, commensalism, and the idea of organisms interacting together. Think about how that might connect to evolution. If you have a dependency, if those organisms need each other, one of the organisms changes over time, the other organism is going to also need to change to keep that interaction going. We're going to watch a short video about this idea of coevolution.
Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and in this podcast I'm going to talk about coevolution. Coevolution is essentially when two species head down an evolutionary pathway together. And so insects and flowers are a great example of that. This bee is taking nectar from the flower, and in return it's transferring some of this pollen down here to another flower. And so the insect gets an advantage from that, and the flower gets an advantage from that. And it's worked so well that half of all animals on the planet aren't only insects, but are beetles, which are a specific type of insect. And so insects have done very well, and flowering plants have done very well as well. And so angiosperms, or flowering plants, make up most of the plants that you see. Grasses, big maple trees, those are all angiosperms. And so they both have benefited from this mutualistic relationship, and that's coevolution. And so I wanted to think of an analogy that would explain kind of how this works. But beware, this is an analogy. This is not evolution or coevolution at all. But think of those first humans when they were on the planet and they were trying to find something to eat. Well, once they developed a primitive spearhead and could throw that and kill a mammoth, that gave them an advantage, gave them food, gave them more time to think about technology. And so eventually we came up with the wheel, which made us more powerful and more mobile. We could move material around. And with that extra time and that mobility, we started to share ideas, and we eventually started to print these ideas and share them. And so technology really took off to the point where once we had done this, the wheel, the printing press, then it wasn't long before we were in space. And so you could say that humans and technology are co-evolving with each other, and they both get advantage from that relationship. So again, that's simply an analogy to kind of explain how it works. And so before we talk specifically about coevolution, what it is, we should say what it's not. And so coevolution is not convergent evolution. This is sometimes confused by students. Convergent evolution is when you have two species that aren't related at all, and then they end up looking like each other because they live in a similar niche or they fill a similar role. And so if you were to just look at these quickly, we've got a shark, a dolphin, and then this is an extinct ichthyosaurus, you would say, well, they all look very similar, but they're not related at all. Even though there are similarities, if you look at it, they all have dorsal fins. They all have pectoral fins that allow them some stability. There are a few key differences. If you were to look at this, the dolphin's going to have a horizontal caudal tail, and that's because it evolved from a mammal that walked on land, whereas these evolved from early fishes or early reptiles. Or if we look at the pillbug here in this millipede, they both look the same because that gives them defense and they can roll up in a ball. And so that's convergent evolution, and these things normally aren't related at all. Another quick thing you should understand is coevolution is not between species and their environment. And so if we look at the peppered moth, remember, during the Industrial Revolution, the plants were covered in soot. And so all of a sudden, moths that look like this, dark moths, had an advantage. Well, right now, with global warming, as we start to have spring come earlier and earlier and earlier, as species start to flower earlier, that's not coevolution with the environment, it's basically adapting to your environment. And then coevolution is not necessarily between friends. And so this right here is the rough-skinned newt. It's one of the most toxic animals on the planet. It has a neurotoxin. If you were to eat a newt, you would die. If we were to take a newt, boil it in water, and then serve it to people, all the people would die. It's a nasty neurotoxin. Now, they don't bite, and so it's not a big deal. And you might think, well, why are they so toxic? Well, the only thing that preys on the rough-skinned newt is this garter snake. And this garter snake has evolved a resistance to that toxin. It's funny, though. They'll eat a rough-skinned newt, and they'll kind of enter into a coma where they have to metabolize that toxin before they can move on. And so basically it's coevolution where the newt developed toxin, the garter snake developed resistance to that, so they got more toxin, more resistance, more toxin, more resistance, more toxin, more resistance. And so again, this is not good for both of them. They're on this evolutionary arms race. Now something unique, most of the garter snakes around here don't look colored, this bright coloration, and the ones that eat the rough-skinned newt actually get some protection from the toxin and start to have a brighter color. And so that's not that is coevolution, but it's when it hurts both of them. And so basically on the next 3 slides, I want to talk about some symbiotic relationships that evolved through coevolution, and they're just radical examples of that. And so this right here is an acacia tree. And this is an acacia ant, and here's a bunch of acacia ants living on an acacia tree. Now, how does this relationship work? Well, basically the acacia tree will give off an odor that attracts female queen acacia ants, and they'll be drawn to that plant. They'll lay their eggs inside it, and they actually live in the acacia tree. There are hollow sections of it. These are the thorns, but there are hollow sections where they live, and so they get a home. And they're even fed. The acacia tree produces these little bodies that are filled with sugar, and so they have something to eat. So what does the acacia ant provide to them? Well, they provide protection. If you touch an acacia tree, these acacia ants will storm all over you and bite you, so it's very painful, and that's going to keep insects off and animals from browsing on the leaves. And they'll also trim vegetation around it. So if a tree starts to grow onto an area where the acacia tree is, the ants will climb over and they'll cut off those leaves. Or they'll even go in the area around the acacia tree and kill any plants that start to go. And so basically this is pretty advanced relationship. And so it's evolved through step-by-step interactions where they're each getting an advantage. Old story is this. The orchid was sent to Darwin, and it had this really long reproductive path down to where the ovules formed. And basically what Darwin formulated is that there must be some kind of a pollinator, maybe a moth that has like a really long proboscis that it could actually fertilize this and help fertilize this plant. Darwin dies. 21 years later, they develop this moth, or they discover this moth, rather, that has this incredibly long proboscis. And it doesn't usually look like that. Usually it'd be wound up in a moth like this. But this one had evolved this radically long proboscis, and it did that step by step, where it first of all had a slightly longer one and a longer one, and now the two of them, the orchid and the moth, were locked together in this coevolutionary pathway, and eventually it just kind of got almost out of control. And then my favorite example is this. When we travel to the Amazon, one of the first things you see right away are these leafcutter ants everywhere. They're basically cutting little sections of the leaf off and then returning it to their mound. So you can see them right here. Now the mound is underground. It'll be in an area where there are no trees around it, but basically what they're doing is they're chewing that leaf down, and then they're feeding it to this, the fungus. And this is the ant, the queen ant. And so basically you'll have ants that go gather leaves, but you'll also have little worker ants that are living inside and on the fungus. And what they found is that the fungus never really was infected with bacteria. It just grew well. We thought these were like perfect farmer ants that would somehow never be plagued by pests. But when they looked closer at a lot of the ants who worked in and around the fungus, they found that there was this white fuzz growing on their mouth. And when they looked at that under the microscope, they found that there was a certain type of bacteria, a streptomyces bacteria. And what was happening is that it was actually producing antibiotics, which was killing bacteria growing on the fungus. And the cool thing about that is in humans, and this actually is the same type where we get a lot of our antibiotics, the cool part of that is that the bacteria that live on the fungus are never going to evolve a resistance to that antibiotic because this streptomycin is actually alive, so it's co-evolving as well. And so we have all of these coevolutionary adaptations, groups that are growing, symbiosis upon symbiosis. And that's one of the reasons why I love biology so much. It's hard to even think of all these relationships, But again, that's coevolution, and I hope that's helpful.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about patterns of evolution. And remember, Darwin kind of thought of the idea of evolution as little slow baby steps. Each generation a little bit different, slow changes over long periods of time, and that slowly these small differences would slowly add up to big changes over long periods of time. The biological change is happening at a slow pace. Is called gradualism. We talked about gradualism, the earth changing, rocks changing, but Darwin kind of took that idea to apply to living things as well, that living things are going to slowly change over time, and that we could see that happening in the fossil record. Remember, we talked about lots of in-between transitional fossils that show slow, incremental changes, slow over time. But that's not the only pattern that we see in the fossil record. The fossil record also shows in some kinds of organisms that evolution happens much more quickly. And instead of slow baby steps change over time, that we actually see kind of bursts of evolution where rapid, quick change, and then long periods of stable, no change over time. And that idea of long, stable pattern of no change interrupted by rapid change is called punctuated equilibrium. And that's the last kind of pattern that we see in the fossil record. We do see Darwin's idea of gradualism, slow change over time, when we look at transitional fossils like the changes between fish ancestors and amphibians. But we also see these kind of bursts of evolutionary change, and we see it, for example, in the fossil record that looks at horse evolution and how horses have changed radically from the ancient ancestor, very small, not the size of horses, modern horses at all. And this idea of rapid change quickly and then long periods where we don't see change. Rapid evolution after long periods of equilibrium could occur for several reasons. It happens when a small population is isolated from the main population, or a small group migrates to a new environment like the Galapagos. We may kind of see no change for long periods, and then rapid change to cause lots of different kinds of species quickly.